Let's go to the NFL. It is, of course, that time of year. And Micah Parsons, Rob, one of the great defenders in the league today. 2 fantastic games to start the season. And I actually thought through the first 2 games of the year, he was the MVP. Now, that's obviously early, but, I thought he was the best player in football through those first 2 games. Obviously, now that wouldn't be the case. Tua Tagovailoa would be the number 1 guy right now in the MVP race. And Micah wouldn't be that close because he didn't dazzle, to say the least, in the third game, a loss to the mediocre at best Arizona Cardinals. But, Rob, a lot of people, I've mentioned him and Lawrence Taylor before. A lot of people really started comparing them recently. And Bill Belichick has talked about that. Here he is.
Comparing players like that, it's not really. I would just say, I wouldn't put anybody ahead of Lawrence Taylor, period. No, maybe I'm prejudiced, but I saw that guy every day for over a decade, and he tilted the field for a decade. So until somebody does that, and there's a lot of great players, I'm not taking anything away from anybody else. There's a lot of great players that have been in this league, that are in this league, but personally, I'm not putting anybody ahead of Lawrence Taylor. Not yet.
Chris, I'm with Bill Belichick, and I had the pleasure. I was a young reporter in New York, Chris, and I covered Lawrence Taylor. I saw it up close.
Yep.
I was at Giant Stadium, the old Giant Stadium, and covered those games. Lawrence Taylor was a wrecking machine, and that is no diss to Micah. You know what I mean, Chris? I'm not saying he can't play or he's not a tremendous football player. Right. But I'm sorry. Lawrence Taylor, and Bill Belichick said it. He tilted the field, Chris. He tilted the field, and he was one of those guys that you had to know where he was on the field. I don't care who was playing, who was quarterback, any other position. Lawrence Taylor was a monster, Chris. And when you look at Micah Parsons, here's the problem. There are other guys, Chris, who have, even better numbers than him. He's not even like the best pass rusher since he's been in the league. You know what I'm like? So how can we? I know it's great because when he first came on the scene, he was all over the place, and people were like, "How do you defend this guy?" And his presence, Chris, was electric when you watch the game. Correct? Like there he is,
Micah.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Electric. There he is. He got through again. Oh, my God. They can't block him. It felt like that. But if you pull the curtain back on some other players during this time, how about T.J. Watt, Chris? In 8 less games, 3.5 more sacks, 1 more fumble recovery, 1 more forced fumble, same number of defensive touchdowns, and 1 less quarterback hit. He was a defensive player of the year. Micah does not have that. He hasn't done it yet. So there are other players who you could put ahead of him already at this point. So it hasn't been like the meteoric start to where he's got all those things. Like Patrick Mahomes is one of those guys who has all those things, Chris, from the very beginning. The MVP, the Super Bowl, he has the hardware.
Right.
And Micah Parsons just doesn't have that yet.
Well, look, I certainly agree with Bill Belichick saying you don't put anybody ahead of LT. LT is, Rob, not only, I think virtually everybody says the greatest defensive player ever. He's in the discussion for greatest football player ever.
He's got to be up there in the top 3.
I'm one that doesn't put Tom Brady. I think Tom Brady's the best quarterback ever.
I think Tom Brady.
I would never say the best football player ever. But LT's in that discussion. And in fairness to people, I don't think anybody, and Rob G, speak up if you can think of someone. I don't think anybody's put Micah ahead of LT.
No, but just that he's in that conversation, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but Belichick did. Now, I don't know if he was being strategic, but he said I wouldn't put anybody ahead of LT. He didn't say I wouldn't put anybody in the conversation with Lawrence Taylor. I wouldn't put anybody on the same level as Lawrence Taylor. He didn't say the comparisons are ridiculous. He just said I wouldn't put anybody ahead, which everybody would agree with that. Here's the one pushback I'd have on because you kind of said the numbers, you got guys. I mean, Nick Bosa was Defensive Player of the Year last year. TJ Watt's numbers are better than Micah's. It is a lot. I mean, Micah's got good numbers too, but it is a lot of just watching the game, and I know you watch them as well. So I'm not saying you don't. But it's watching Micah and what he's doing on the field. Again, particularly in those first two games where he's lining up on so many different parts of the field, the line of scrimmage, and he is just putting so much pressure on the quarterbacks. Whether he sacks them or not, the havoc he was wreaking and how he was making the offense have to account for him, that is what had people like, my goodness, this looks like Lawrence Taylor. And like I said, it's not just about numbers. Lawrence Taylor only led the league in sacks one time. And he only led the league. That was the only category he ever led the league in. He had one touchdown 1 year, his second year. That was tied for the most by a defensive player. But he never led the league in fumbles recovered, fumbles forced, or, anything. I mean, fumbles forced, they didn't keep it that time, but fumbles, he didn't lead the league in any of that stuff. His first 2 years, Rob, 9.5 sacks his first year, 7.5 his second year, 9 his third year, but he was Defensive Player of the Year his first 2 years. Yeah, right. So again, it was about people just looking, similar to Micah, people just looking at the impact he was having on the game, not just how many sacks he got and things like that.
Yeah, I get that, but the same thing, Chris. If you look at Micah without and saying he doesn't have the big numbers and looking at him,
and he does have good. Micah's got 13 sacks his first year, 13.5 last year.
But winning Defensive Player of the Year is what separates the two. You talked about his first
second both years.
Yeah, the first 2 years, and the other thing too is obviously the Giants won 2 Super Bowls with LT there, and that was a big part of it. And their defense back then, absolutely. Chris, was a monster. That was the team. They had Phil Simms, and they won with Jeff Hostetler, right? Yep. It didn't matter the quarterback. Phil Simms wasn't some big-time 400-yard passer or anything. He was a good quarterback, wasn't great. And Jeff Hostetler filled in when he was hurt, and they won 2 Super Bowls. Their defense was what that team was all about.
Yeah, no question. And I think, too, and Rob, if I'm not mistaken, and this is funny, but, it's you just you have to understand, and you'll get what I'm saying, Rob. Someone posted, I believe, because it was talked about at my job, the TV show First Things First. Obviously Joe Namath was critical of Zach Wilson, and someone posted their numbers. And as you might imagine, Rob, Zach Wilson's were rivaling Joe Namath.
Yeah, okay.
But obviously, you can't put Zach Wilson in the same sentence as Joe Namath.
But it's a different game.
All-time great stop. And all that.
And Joe Namath has some things, Chris, when you talk about it. I'm not here to say Joe Namath was the greatest quarterback or anything like that.
He was a legit Hall of Famer.
And first to throw for 4,000 yards. They weren't throwing the football like that. People can say whatever they want. 4,000 back then, Chris, that was a lot of yards that he threw for.
Oh, God.
And he won a Super Bowl against the Baltimore Colts, who were one of the greatest football teams at that time, Chris, right? In NFL history with Don Shula, who was the head coach of that team.
Well, he led the AFL twice in passing yards, led the NFL once, led the NFL in passing touchdowns. This is Joe Namath I'm talking about. Led the league's total 3 times in yards per game. Like, he was, at that time, my point is you can't just look at the numbers, because quarterbacks and receivers were not protected like they are today. So the numbers are going to be much better today, nor did they throw it as much. Even Namath throwing for 4,000 yards, he didn't throw it nearly as much as quarterbacks do today. So
and
that's something. And I brought that up because it's similar with sacks, Rob. Now, Lawrence Taylor had 20 sacks. The year he won, they won the Super Bowl in 85 or 86, but the 85 season. He had 20 and a half sacks to lead the league. That was his third Defensive Player of the Year award. That's the year he won the MVP, last defensive player to do it. Guys should get, and I don't know if it was Rod Woodson who mentioned it on our show or I heard it somewhere else, Rob, but he's right. Guys should get more sacks today because they throw it so much.
They throw the ball, and that's what I was going to say, Chris. LT having 20 and a half sacks in 1986, that might be 35 sacks today. Because he knows that, you know what I mean? Because think about that. They were running the ball. They had running backs. You didn't know it was a pass every down or 3 out of 4 downs. That's an incredible number.
Just
running. Just forget about somebody running by you.
The quarterback no doubt about it. So you just need to keep that in mind as you look. I'm talking to the listeners as you look at some of these stats. Don't rush out there. Remember the person rushed out there a few years ago, Rob, when Ryan Fitzpatrick was in one of his little Fitz magic runs for 3 or 4 games
before he turned back into a pumpkin.
Right, and they said he's got more career touchdown passes than Troy Aikman. I mean, it ended up looking foolish because you have to understand the context. It's like saying LeBron James has more 3-pointers made than Larry Bird.
Right.
So he's a better 3-point shooter. I mean, you got to understand the context. And so it's the same with sacks. Sacks is probably not quite as pronounced as, the quarterback stats and the differences. But just be aware of that when you look at stat numbers for sacks, because they should. There's so many more opportunities now to sack the quarterback than there used to be. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, look, I think Micah reminds a lot of, I think the best way to say it, Robbie, he reminds a lot of people of Lawrence Taylor. Now he's got a long way to go before he can ever be really, compared to Lawrence Taylor. Like you said, Lawrence has 3 Defensive Player of the
and won his first
awards.
2.
That's crazy.
Right.
His first 2 years he did that. This is, like I said, the best player defensively ever. Last defensive player to win an MVP. And so you just got to keep that in mind. But Micah, look, it'll be interesting to watch him. Let me throw this out to you.
And there's no diss to him, Chris. Not at all.
Not at all. No, not at all. Let me throw this out to you and quickly, because we're going to get to the listeners. Mike, I've said Micah's got to be careful with that podcast. I don't want to get in his pockets. Let him make his money. Let him do his podcast. That's fine. But, Rob, when you look at most of the players that do, the current players that do it, you have a lot of retired players, obviously. But the current players, for the most part, I might be missing a youngin' out there. But Jason and Travis Kelce, veterans who've won championships. Draymond Green, veteran who won championships. Paul George and Patrick Beverly, not championship they haven't won, but they're veterans, longtime veterans. You don't see a ton of just young guys, Rob. And my point is, he could say a lot of stuff that could come back to haunt their team or be bulletin board material for other teams, because you're just a young guy, you're running off at the mouth, and you have not yet delivered a ring. And so I just think they got to be careful with that.